Today on Quest, Harvard chaplains Pat and Tammy McLeod. Life is a quest for logic and reason. It is a quest to find balance between science and faith. Life is a quest for knowledge and understanding. But most importantly, it's a quest for personal discovery. Whatever your quest, knowing yourself is the beginning of all wisdom. Welcome to Quest. Hello everyone, I'm your host, Todd Fischer, and this is Quest. For those of you that might be new listeners, let me tell you a little about me. I'm the founder of Metatomics and the author of the best-selling book, Metatomics, The Grand Design. I'm a philosopher, a theorist, a metaphysicist. I'm a perpetual pupil of theology, and I'm an expert in comparative religious study. I've also extensively researched the mind-body connection, anatomy, and physiology. I documented over 300 case studies while researching my book, all from a scientific perspective, with cases that ranged from near-death and out-of-body experiences to possession to past life experiences, as well as the metaphysical, the paranormal, and other unexplained cases of a spiritual nature. This podcast will bring you some of those astonishing stories, and in some cases by the people that actually lived them. From time to time, I'll be talking about important, perhaps even controversial issues from both spiritual and scientific points of view. The world we live in is ever-changing, and there's often a conflict between spirituality and science. And I wanted to bring you this podcast to balance that equation. It will show you how we know what we know. And there's still so much we don't know. For me, curiosity is part of what makes us human. It's the joy of discovery. It's what drives us. It's our quest. On today's episode of Quest, Pat and Tammy McLeod join me in a discussion about ambiguous loss and the heartbreaking situation that happened to their son. Here's my interview with Pat and Tammy. Hi, Pat. Hi, Tammy. Welcome to the podcast.
Thanks so much. Great to be here.
Well, I'm glad we could get this scheduled during the busy holiday season. We were able to, at the time of this recording, it's right before Thanksgiving. I think that this one will come out sometime in December. But it's been a crazy year, to say the least. And when I found Tammy on LinkedIn, and I saw that she is a Harvard chaplain, and both of you have this incredible story that I'm going to have you tell today. But before we get into that, I want to ask you about being a chaplain. So you're at Harvard University. What's for people that aren't sure what a chaplain is? What does the job of a chaplain entail, particularly at a university like this?
Pat and I are both Harvard chaplains, but the chaplain will minister to people who are outside of their normal context. So in other words, these students are away from their homes and away from their faith communities. And so we're just available to them to help them develop their spiritual lives in college.
Yeah, Todd, I think in general, the chaplain idea is, whether it be a military chaplain or a hospital chaplain, or in our case, a campus ministry chaplain, they're in a place where people have been displaced. So hence the word chaplain.
Sure. And is this available for students and for faculty both?
Yes. So we meet sometimes with students, mostly undergraduates, and once in a while we meet with professors or other staff at the university.
And some of our programming brings them both together. Sometimes the professors who are, Christians will address and speak to a large group of our students and talk about their particular field of expertise, but from their own Christian perspective.
Sure. Is there a large spiritual population at Harvard?
Yes, so we have 35 chaplains at Harvard from every
Wow.
faith tradition that you could imagine. We have secular humanist chaplain, Buddhist, Hindu, Zoroastrian, Muslim.
Humanist.
Yeah.
Wow. How do you get started doing something like this? Tell me your background. How did you move toward doing what you do today?
So for me, my sorority president in college asked me 3 tough questions. Why are you here? Where are you going? And what makes you happy? And those 3 questions made me think about these issues for the first time in my life. And I wrote about growing up in a great family, having a lot of friends, a lot of achievements in high school. And I thought the answers to your questions would be in those things. But as I thought and wrote, I realized that all they did was keep me busy, so that I didn't actually address questions like this. And I had this great emptiness inside. So during my sophomore year of college is when I actually heard for the first time how to know Christ personally. And I gave my life to Christ, began following him as a 20-year-old. And it's interesting because I think that affected what I chose to do with my life, that my life was greatly impacted by God reaching out to me as a college student. And I wanted to help others think through these questions as a student.
Sure. And let me ask you this, and Pat, I would definitely want to hear your how you got into this too. But Tammy, did you grow up in a religious household when you were younger?
Yes, my parents took me to church, but I don't know what happened when I was there. Somehow I missed what is going on in church. I
Sure.
just attended, but I didn't know about how Jesus fit into the picture, that God loved us, but we were separated from him. So Christ died for our sin to bring us back to him. So I don't know if I was sleeping or what.
Well, you got the message eventually, and that's the important part. Even if it was at 20, it's fine, for sure. But I'm always curious because, I do hear a lot of stories about people that don't grow up in religious households, and then they find this on their own when they get into high school or they get into college. So that's why I was curious if you actually had a religious household. And Pat, what about you? Tell me your story. How did you
Todd,
move?
that's a nice transition to mine because mine is that story you just described. So I was raised in I don't think it was hostile toward religion, but very pluralistic. My dad was, at least, in his, in the regard with, he held all religions in pretty high regard, and was kind of covering all of his bases there. And but we were mostly, a secular family who had made a God out of success, and in particular athletic achievement. My dad was a coach, my mom was a coach, both brothers were football players. My oldest brother was a professional football player. I was kind of, that was sort of my God. But because of it, you know how superstitious often athletes can be. I was very curious about getting God on my side if I could.
Yeah, for sure.
But it was actually an injury that brought me to a point of realizing there has to be more to life than this. And actually, no, there was one other thing. Success. Actually, the most empty moments in my life came on the heels of my greatest moments of athletic success, and that really puzzled me. And so in college, one of my teammates, he was great. In fact, he got drafted and was very, he was an excellent player. He invited me to an Athletes in Action meeting where I, for the first time, was given a chance to really wrestle with the story of the Christian gospel, and it was very compelling to me. And that the night that I committed my life to Christ really marked a significant turning point, not just in my spiritual life, but in my career choice. Because at that point, I just realized that this is a life-changing story, and everything is affected by this. And so both of us tried to do teaching and coaching for a while after we graduated, but the thing that we loved most about our career was the stuff we were doing on the side, which was trying to help students in their own spiritual journey. And we just thought, why don't we just do this full time? And so we did.
That's great. That's great. And then where did you both go to college at?
I went to Westchester outside of Philadelphia.
Okay.
And it's a big music school. I was a voice major.
And I went to Montana State University.
And how did the two of you meet?
We met on a summer mission.
A summer mission, all right.
We met on the boardwalk of New Jersey, of Wildwood, New Jersey.
Well, see, the listeners are going to want to know how two of you from different walks of life in different parts of the country actually met. Because here you kind of work together, you have a family together, and that's a truly magical thing, I think.
Yeah.
It was, Matt. It was love at first sight for me. Not for her though, but that's what
that's great.
It was a magical moment, and neither of us were really looking for. We had pretty much decided we were going to go be missionaries overseas, and then we kind of bumped into each other and ended up getting married. And
yeah, and how long have you been in the Northeast? Is that where you decided you wanted to have your family and you wanted everyone to grow up? Like, tell me that part.
No, we had our children in Bozeman, Montana.
Oh, okay.
So we lived on an acre of land at the base of the Rocky Mountains and looked out at deer running through our yard and wildflowers. And now we live in Harvard Square and watch the traffic go by. We can't see any stars. We used to sit on our deck in Montana and look at the stars. Big difference.
At night, you can feel the subway shaking the ground of the house.
Wow.
We're literally, like probably about 30 feet or 30 yards from the subway.
We've been here 21 years.
Yeah. And has it, this year has been a really crazy year, and this year's not even over yet. I've said this on a lot of different podcasts, but we started this year with hearing about Jeffrey Epstein and Harvey Weinstein, these terrible stories in the news, and then COVID started to creep into the world and the news cycle, and then that's been our spring and summer, and we're still in the middle of this, and we've had marches and riots and all of these things that have happened. And it was already an election year, which it was already a weird year to begin with, right?
Yeah.
So what is the feeling, what's the general feeling there being, in a city like this and a campus like this versus the country? Do you feel safer these days where you're at? What do you think about just kind of the state of living today?
That's a good question, Todd. I mean, I've had moments of just like wondering what is going to happen with this election, and things are sort of, the dust is settling. It was an interesting thing here in Boston. I was actually driving around the city delivering some things to some people when they announced that Biden had won, and people everywhere were outside honking their horns. There was just this levity. I think most people were relieved that it was over, but there was just a tremendous amount of support behind the Biden. At least the people that were outside honking their horns were, I'm sure. About 40% of them were inside, not scowling, but whatever.
Right.
It's pretty different than what it would have been like, I think, for us if we were back in Montana.
I often wonder, when we have a year like this, let's just say, one of these things had happened, but we have COVID, which is life-threatening to people. There's a lot of unrest ethnically right now with people. No one wants to be a police officer today. People are losing their jobs. Anytime we have situations like this, just one of these things might be bad enough, but we have a piled on top of piled on top of piled on top of piles of problems this year. Do you think that people move toward looking for spirituality or strengthening their faith in times like this? Or do you feel like people start to lose faith because they're praying for solutions and they're not getting them? Do you have a feeling one way or another?
There was one student who contacted us at the beginning of the year, and we work a lot with athletes, and she said, I'm taking a break since there are no sports at Harvard this fall, so I'm gonna have a gap year this year.
Sure.
And I want to think about my life and the big questions of life. So she found us on our website and then got involved with our group. One of the things that we did this year in light of what was going on is to implement something we worked on all of last year, which was something about Jesus and anxiety. And we called it Unfiltered Conversations. It was a 4-week series where we would talk about anxiety and how we're really doing with what's going on in the world. And so that was really meaningful to her to be able to just get to talk about how she's really doing with all that's going on.
And she's come alive. She now identifies as a Christian, and so she would represent that one side of the equation you've just described, of people who, this has given them time and space to reflect upon the big questions, like what is the purpose of life? Is there a God? What's, who am I really? And those kinds of questions. And so I think it's probably true that there are others who are, I have concerns just about how isolating this has been for so many people, and what the effects of that will be on their long-term mental, emotional health, physical health. So, I think that you could probably find stories that would support both of those ideas that you mentioned.
Sure. And one thing that really annoyed me this year more than anything was when churches were shut down. And I think I'm a little more volatile when it comes to talking about this than most are, but I considered church to be an essential service. And I didn't feel like it was something that should have been shut down. What are your feelings on churches being shut down? Should a state have that kind of power to shut a church down?
In our church, we have a lot of doctors. So we have a medical team that we consult with all the time, and they basically said we want to be only online. So 11 a.m. and 4 p.m. because of transmission. So we started online at 11 to 4, and then eventually we opened with no singing at 8:30. So people would come in masked and sit 6 feet apart and just do call and response, like there would be a liturgy of speaking, but no singing. So
yeah,
yesterday we just started singing, but that's only in one service at 8:30. Most of their congregation is they're in their homes on their couches watching the service.
Yeah. Well, we're lucky we have the technology to do that today.
Yeah.
We're fortunate in that regard. I felt like there could be, precautions taken. I think early on there was a real fear of what this was and how this could be transmitted. And I think there was a significant fear on how to handle it. But technology was able to keep things going. I think on another level too, churches shutting down, there's a lot of services that churches offer. They'll offer, feeding the homeless or places for people to stay or shower. There are churches that host like 12-step programs. And when the churches shut down, in some cases, alcoholics and drug addicts had nowhere to go. They couldn't take meetings. Some people didn't have the technology. There's a lot of people that can't afford an iPhone and couldn't. And my strong feeling was that the churches should have been kind of maybe designated as an essential service for people to be able to show up. And then that's my feeling on it. I see the strength in this both ways.
Yes, we do actually have an AA that meets in our building, and they couldn't meet. So
and that's triggering for some people, I think, when they can't make those meetings. And I felt sorry in a lot of cases with that. I want to move toward a different topic, because I think COVID kind of works into this, but you all have a personal story kind of about this too. I want to talk about ambiguous loss. And that was a topic we Tammy and I discussed on LinkedIn. We wanted to bring up. And I haven't talked about this on any of my podcasts. I want you to explain to my listeners what ambiguous loss is.
Okay. I was trying to read books on grief, and they weren't helping me because
you should mention
our son did not die. He was playing football and he had a massive traumatic brain injury and was airlifted from the field to the hospital. And when we got there, the doctor said, we're going to need to do surgery, and this could result in full recovery or death or anything in between. And so after the surgery, Zach made it through, and he had to learn to swallow again, to sit, to stand, to walk. So he went straight from the ICU to acute rehab for 4 months and learned everything again, like how to dress himself and eat again, and a little bit of speaking. So right now he has very little short-term memory, very little speech. He has a gait belt. You have to hold on to him with every step or he could fall. He has right side weakness of all kinds. And so he became instantly severely disabled for life. He lives in a group home and has one-on-one care around the clock. The person actually sits by his bed and in the middle of the night walks him to the bathroom.
How old was Zach when he suffered the injury?
He was 17.
So he had a high school injury.
2 days before his 17th birthday, actually.
Wow.
So the grief books, since he didn't die, they weren't helping. I asked people, do you have any recommendations for me? And nobody had recommendations. So I called Spalding Rehab and said, can you give me a term? I want to write a research paper on this in seminary. And the next day, the librarian wrote with the term ambiguous loss. He says, that's what you're going through. And he sent me links by Pauline Boss, who's actually the expert. She coined the term. And I tore into her books and I thought, finally, someone understands me. But ambiguous loss is physical absence with psychological presence. That would be examples: missing people due to war or terrorism, natural disasters, kidnapping, incarceration, divorce, adoption, immigration. And then on the other hand, what we're dealing with, there's a second type. It's psychological absence with physical presence. So Alzheimer's disease, other dementias, traumatic brain injury, chronic mental illness, or addictions like drugs, alcohol, gambling. So you have the person and you don't have the person.
Yeah. Wow. And when, if you don't mind me asking, when Zach took the injury, I assume he took a helmet-to-helmet hit or something like that. Is that what happened?
Actually, it's really difficult to see any hit like that. So there, it's even that's somewhat ambiguous. He actually went down on a pile, team tackle, and was slow getting up. And when he went back to the huddle and broke the huddle, he kind of stumbled coming out of the huddle. And the coach, jokingly, because it was at a scrimmage, he said, "Got to look out for those lines on the field, McLeod." And Zach didn't really respond well. And so he just walked out on the field and he looked him in the eye and he said, "Are you all right?" And he said, "I'm fine, coach." And then collapsed right there on the spot. And so, we've looked and relooked at not just that last tackle, but everything that preceded it, which wasn't much. It was probably the fourth play of the scrimmage. So this right before that, he had intercepted the opening pass and ran it back for a touchdown. And then he had run down on a kickoff. And then, like I said, he was in on this team tackle and got up slowly. Somewhat mysterious.
And the personality your son had before, that's missing today?
Oh yeah, I forgot to tell you about that. He's the most happy, joyful person you can imagine. So he's full of life, excited, loves to hug people.
It's not changed his personality, it's just accentuated qualities of his character.
Sure. Yeah. I see. So it's physical ailments more than anything with him. Is that what it is?
Well, even though the personality is intact, his ability to process things mentally is significantly impaired. I mean, his memory's sharp, but it's just like there are some cognitive deficits for sure.
He knows everything that you say to him. So he has long-term memory and he can remember his friends when they come over and the stories they tell. But once his friends leave, if you ask him 5 minutes later, who was just here visiting you? He has no idea.
I see. What are your feelings on football today?
Oh, we totally disagree with each other on this. I think that Zach had second impact syndrome. I think he was hit before and then concussed before, and then it didn't heal and he got hit again. And that led to the massive swelling. That was what the Spalding brain rehab doctor said was his best guess. I found in his backpack aspirins. Once they returned it from his school, he asked me on Wednesday, he said, I have a headache, Mom. No, he didn't even say that. He said, do you have any aspirin? I said, sure. And I just handed him the aspirin. I had no idea what was going on. But two of his friends told us much later, like months after the injury, one even years after, that Zach actually asked them, what does a concussion feel like? So Zach asked one teammate on Wednesday that question, and then he asked another teammate on Friday on the bus on the way to the scrimmage, what does a concussion feel like?
Wow.
So my best guess is he had one.
And Pat, you played football. So what are your feelings on the sport at this point?
I mean, Todd, it's evolving, I would say. From the beginning, I would say I saw this as a fluke, as something that could have happened if he would have fallen off his bike on his way to practice. And actually, the chances of this kind of injury happening are probably greater from bike accidents than they are football. I mean, concussions happen a lot in football, but not traumatic brain injuries. So I've been of the opinion that, that this was a really unfortunate accident that rarely happens in the game. And but more recently, I'm starting to question, my views on the game. I mean, it's a pretty brutal game. Tammy's reading a book right now about it. She could tell you that really is forcing me to wrestle with the ethics of the game. I can give you my big defense for it. You want to hear that?
Yeah, I want to hear it. Yeah.
I personally have an issue with the radical individualism that marks our culture. I think we are arguably the most radically individualistic society that's ever existed on this planet. And I think that's not all good. I think we've been made for community and communion. And I have deeply held religious convictions about this person. But when it comes to football, it's just amazing that you have this one game that can attract such a diverse spectrum of athleticisms and abilities, from your 300 plus pound lineman to this, 140 pound sprinter to, a guy that can just kick a ball to, people that are, somewhere in between on all these things. Anyway, there's just, you've got all of that diversity, and then you put 50 of them together who form a team and form these bonds, and you can never, succeed unless you can do it as a team. And, it's there's just nothing quite like that. And so that's my argument. And in addition to the fact that I do think there's some really important qualities of character that are cultivated in the life of someone who plays this game that are important in our society. So, I mean, determination and discipline, dedication, the teamwork, the humility, the ability to be coached, and all of those kinds of things are just amazing.
So Pat watches football with Zach on Sundays.
Zach still loves it too.
And I don't watch it. So.
Yeah. It's tough. That's probably the biggest sport in America, professional football. And so it's tough to, start to kind of poke holes in that because of the dangers in it. And then it's, where does it end? Is it boxing next? Is it soccer after that? Like what sport will people go through? And I think there is a lot of science these days more into the kind of the repercussions of concussions, and you're getting boxers and professional wrestlers and football players donating their brains to science, and more things are being looked at now to really look into this. Mm-hmm. But it's kind of hard to fight that big engine like that, to go after the NFL to protect players more, because eventually I think that the sport could be dumbed down so much it could become flag football. There's no, and then who will watch it then? And that's what money is, the thing, and that's what keeps all of this rolling. And they're willing to overlook the small amount of injuries that happen versus the long-term goal of money. And that's unfortunate. I want to ask you, certainly you all have probably experienced loss at some point, a parent or a brother or a sister, losing those people to death. How is a situation like this with your son, who is still alive, but certainly changed, different than actually the death of a close relative? Is it similar? Is it different? Are they faith-shaking things? Can you define the difference?
Yes, I can try. I can say this, that the challenging thing about an ambiguous loss, which, by the way, the person who coined the term calls it the most stressful kind of loss. What are the reasons why she says that?
Just because there's no linear process of letting go, and rarely is there acceptance, and there's never closure. And it reminds people of something they can't fix or cure. And in America, we think we can fix and cure everything, but we can't. And then it's hard to find meaning and make sense of something that defies logic and resolution. And then it's rarely validated. So we have funerals when people die, but when something happens like to our son, there are no public ceremonies for grief. And then the last thing I would say, just people get stuck or they get frozen in unresolved grief. And then that leads to depression, and that leads to relational conflict. Yeah. So it just puts a lot of torque on relationships.
And what I was going to say to add to that, I think that was a very thorough explanation of what's different about it. I think the challenge of dealing with it personally is that you've got to learn to live well with both having and not having at the same time. And that's tricky, because you typically are going to do one or the other, but not both. Sometimes you won't do either. And it's even more complicated when one person is doing one and the other is doing the other, and you're married. And that's really the story of our book, where one person is completely obsessing over the son that they still have, but living in complete denial about the son that they've lost. And the other is doing just the opposite, so that's one of the reasons we wrote the book, actually, is because that, coming to terms with what was really going on in our marriage was a significant moment in our own journey and story.
Let's go ahead and talk about the book. So you co-authored a book called Hit Hard: One Family's Journey of Letting Go of What Was and Learning to Live with What Is. Well, tell me about that more.
Well, let me say something just about story. Like, I'm a real advocate of the importance of stories. I think we are, after all, storytelling animals. There's a quote by a guy named Robert McKee, who wrote a book called Story. He says, we tell and we take in stories as much as we sleep, and even then we dream. A story has the ability to inspire people, to encourage. Certainly they entertain us, they teach us. A lot of our moral learning comes through stories. Wisdom is acquired through the reading of stories. And as Christians and people who care about theology, we know that a person's theological imagination is also formed by stories. And so we think maybe most importantly that a good story has a way of surfacing and softening some of the hardest emotions of our lives. And that's what we've tried to do with the book Hit Hard, is try to bring people into a story about one of the most stressful kinds of losses, if not the most stressful loss that humans experience, which is ambiguous loss, and see a family of faith journey through that together, both the ups and it's pretty raw. It's pretty at times really sad. It's also at times, I think, surprising. I think it gives a surprising answer to the problem of evil and suffering that people might find particularly meaningful at this time when ambiguous loss is everywhere around us. So would you add anything?
That's good.
And let's talk about that. So when we circled into ambiguous loss, we kind of segued from this COVID experience people have. So people have been experiencing ambiguous loss through this because they haven't been able to see a relative in a nursing home, or they haven't had to have proper funerals and things like that. Let's talk a little bit about how people may be experiencing ambiguous loss today and don't realize what they're actually suffering from. Are those proper cases, what I just mentioned?
Yes. I was thinking about the Harvard students. In a moment, Harvard said you need to leave. So they aren't with their classmates anymore.
Their basketball season was canceled right before the Ivy League tournament.
Yeah. So all of the athletes that we work with lost the seniors lost their last year of play.
Yeah.
Everyone lost their teammates because of their sport.
Their commencement exercise was over. Some of them will never see each other again. It's without a really good goodbye.
Yeah.
So and I think more generally in society, you have tremendous job losses and unemployment, and that with that comes a whole bunch of lost relationships. The people that were suddenly cut off, not just from their coworkers, but from all the people that you sort of meet along the way to and from work every day that are, those relationships are cut off. And it's this ambiguity that actually is really stressful, because all those losses are there, but they're never, it's hard to acknowledge them, and there's no public ceremony of grieving them or letting go of them. So people get stuck in a grief process that can be really, really devastating.
For sure. It seems like you gave me a lot of examples of things I hadn't really thought of. I wasn't an athlete. I didn't have a college experience. I didn't do those things, but I see exactly what you're talking about, and it's quite interesting. Do you think what is the end game for ambiguous loss? Is there a solution to this? Is there a therapy for this? What gets a person through this? Or are we looking at these people that have lost jobs or didn't have their senior years or their proms and these things? Will there be lasting psychological issues with this? Will this be things that will haunt people in 10 and 20 years, do you think? Or what is the process to move through this?
Boss's biggest point is that to be resilient in ambiguous loss, we need to learn how to live with having and not having. And so she actually doesn't think that there is anything in the person's psyche that's wrong. So it's not like a psychological problem, it's a relational problem.
I see.
And so when she brings people into her office, a lot of times she'll bring in the person support network. So people in the family or their pastor or their healthcare provider who would want to come along with them. So she thinks it's really important for people to get connected to each other So really, she doesn't necessarily even think that people need to go to counseling.
Yeah.
They just need to realize these things about ambiguous loss. And her resiliency framework is, she has 6 things that she talks about that will help with resilience and ambiguous loss. And we could talk about them later, but they're also in the book.
I think if I could add to what Tammy said, Todd, one thing I would say that when I think about end game of this is, these smaller stories of loss that we've just described, they beg for a larger story that can make sense of them and that can provide meaning in the midst of them, that can give us hope. And, the religious traditions are the harbinger of those kinds of stories, so for us personally, and that goes back to our story of Hit Hard, that the story of Zach himself, there's some really inspirational things about just his own story as it unfolds in our book. What it does more than anything is I think it points us toward a bigger story that has carried us through this and has given us hope in the midst of it. And even back to that story Tammy told earlier about the Harvard student who converted, who became a follower of Christ in the midst of this pandemic. I mean, she herself was the big turning point in that story for her was she started attending a group where we have a couple of geniuses, basically, who one's a postdoc and the other is working on his PhD. They're both former Ivy League or Harvard students who are now gone and graduated, but we're just hosting a science and Christianity discussion group. And she wanted to go there just to ask some of the questions that she had. And one of her biggest questions was this question of suffering and loss. And so they asked me to come in and talk about it. And one of the things that I shared that I think was a turning point for Cindy was I just said that to our surprise, and we've been asked this several times especially when we've done interviews with people who aren't particularly religious, when they've heard that we're Harvard chaplains and we've had this terribly tragic thing happen. How do we reconcile that with our faith and our belief in a loving God? And I've told them flat out that there have definitely been a lot of times in my life that I've struggled with my faith and had questions about it, but not in the midst of this story and on this journey with Zach. In fact, to the contrary, of the 4 times in my life where I have been most convicted about the reality of God in this world and actually his almost tangible presence in my life at a particular moment, 3 of those happened during this story with Zach, and really actually at the point of greatest sadness and disappointment and loss. But it was being made so aware in those moments that the God that has been revealed to us in the Christian tradition is a crucified God, a God that suffers, and a God who laid down his life. And that realization in those moments was absolutely overwhelmingly comforting to me and consoling to what my heart needed. And so back to Cindy, when she heard that was the thing that pushed her over the edge of what other story can make better sense of a world that is so broken, is so, like you were talking earlier about all this going on in America right now. It just points to the fact that not only is the world broken, but there seems to be something broken inside of each of us. And this story that's been revealed through Jesus is compelling.
Absolutely. What beautiful words to start to wrap up the podcast. I couldn't have said it better. How can people find your book?
So our website is patandtammymcleod.com, and then we have 4 ways that you could purchase it on the website. Right when you open it, it'll be on the first page, or it's just at Amazon.
Okay, great. And people can reach you through your website. Are you also on social media?
Yes. So Instagram, Pat and Tammy McLeod, and Facebook, Pat and Tammy McLeod. And on the website, there's a place where they can write in their name and leave a note so we can correspond with them.
Our email address is on the Harvard Chaplain's website as well.
I think we're both on LinkedIn. I know I am.
I am too.
Yeah, you're both on LinkedIn. That's how I found you, was on LinkedIn. I appreciate you sharing your story today. It really was amazing to hear this and hear what you all have gone through, and just how strong your convictions are today, and how you live your life. It's really incredibly beautiful. And I appreciate you taking the time and sharing this with my listeners.
Thanks so much.
We're so glad that you invited us. Thank you.
Yeah. And we'll maybe we can check back in next year, and we'll see what the state of the world is like.
Absolutely.
But thanks for coming out. Okay.
Yes,
You're welcome.
Thanks.
We'll talk soon. Bye-bye.
Right. Bye-bye.
There you have it. What an incredible story. Let me know what you think. You can send me an email at questwithtodd@gmail.com. I'll see you next week on Quest. Thank you for listening to Quest. Please be sure and rate and review this podcast. This podcast is copyright. Any previously trademarked or copyright content is used by permission. Be sure to visit the official website for the International Association of Metatomics at metatomics.org, or find us on social media for other unique content. And make sure to pick up a copy of the book that started a spiritual revolution, Metatomics, The Grand Design, available for sale online and at most major bookstores. Thanks for listening.